my pleasure and honor to introduce to you the dynamic Maggie Hsu. She is the Chief of Staff for Tony Hsieh, CEO for the online retailer Zappos.com. Hsu literally is in charge of this massive $350 million redevelopment project in downtown in downtown Las Vegas, which we would think of as the city of sin, but not under this magnificent woman's leadership. She is all about raising consciousness in community. Please put a warm applause together for Maggie Hsu. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Oh, okay. Imagine going to work on Monday and receiving a company-wide email that says that all managers have until the end of the year to find a new job or they'll be let go. Now imagine in that same email, it says that anyone who is not on board with the changes that have been happening at this company is free to resign and can receive a minimum of 3 months severance or 1 month for every year worked. That email actually went out to all 1,500 Zappos employees in March of this year. And 14% of the company decided to take that offer. So today, I'm going to talk a bit about Zappos, a bit about this thing called Holacracy, and a bit about what that means for you and your organization. And by the way, the full text of that email is actually available online in case you're curious to read it. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll know why 14% of the company decided to leave. Just a quick background about Zappos. Zappos is a US-based online shoe retailer that was founded in 1999. Its CEO is Tony Hsieh, and he led the company through its acquisition by Amazon in 2009 for $1.2 billion. Today, Zappos has 1,300 employees, and it's very well known for its company culture and its core values. Now, the majority of Zappos employees are call center reps, and a call center is probably the last place you'd think of with a great company culture. What's interesting is that the call center reps aren't measured on any traditional metrics, like time on calls. They're simply asked to wow the customer, to do whatever it takes to wow that customer. There are no financial limitations put on what they can do. There's really nothing that they can't do. And as a result, we have some pretty long call times. Can anyone guess what the longest recorded call time in Zappos history was? Feel free to shout it out. 3 hours, 6. 8 hours was close. It was actually 10 hours. Longer than a shift. I have no idea what they talked about, but if you're curious, I can try and find out. So that's a picture of me with some of my new hire training class. Another way Zappos is different is it actually asks that all new hires go through a 4-week training period, regardless of what position they're hired in to do. And most of that training is actually call center training. So I spent about 2 weeks on the phones talking to customers and really understanding the core of our company's service philosophy. As you can tell, we know how to have a good time as well. When you think of a traditional organization, you probably think about something like this. Very clean, very clear, very defined lines of responsibility and reporting. When in reality, most of our companies are probably a little bit more like this. And I love this slide because it so perfectly illustrates, I won't call it the dysfunction, but just the relationships between people and among people at a company. And it reminds us that a company is not this very clean set of lines like the last picture we saw, but it really is a fairly interesting place to be. And I'll have the slides available later if you want to take that image. So that brings us to something called Holacracy. Holacracy is a new type of organizational system that's about self-management. And so there are actually no bosses. Every employee is empowered to set their own priorities and work on their own projects. And a holacratic org chart looks a little more like this. It's a series of concentric circles, and this is actually the org chart from Holacracy 1. They're the company that founded Holacracy, and their entire org chart, changing every day, is available online on their website. Now, in a holacratic organization, someone with a traditional job title, let's take Sam, who in his prior life was a brand partnerships director, might have multiple roles or titles. He could have 2 roles, he could have 10 roles. They could be in areas as diverse as employee engagement, if he was interested in that, which is a more traditional HR function. They could be in graphic design, if he was interested in that, a more marketing function. He could have as many roles as he wants, and again, these could be linked, or they don't have to be. It's completely up to him. But what he does have is an obligation to sense what are called tensions. And a tension is not a bad thing. It's not a tension that you need to go to the spa and get worked out. It's just a gap between what is and what could be. And a tension could be something as seemingly trivial as the office snack selection. Don't laugh, it was a real tension. To something like a diversity initiative that isn't being highlighted, to the lack of a volunteer opportunity, to a process improvement idea, a collaboration tool that we're not using, or even a new business line. Now, these tensions don't have to have anything to do with Sam's roles, or they might be related to them. His only responsibility is to sense those tensions in his work on a day-to-day basis and to voice them. Now, I wanted to excerpt a little bit of the Holacracy Constitution for you. If any of you have tried to study this, you'll know that it's a pretty complicated thing to understand, almost mind-numbingly, frustratingly so. This is just one small excerpt, and I want to read, I'll spare you the whole thing, but I'll read you the last line. Further, at any point before an asynchronous proposal is adopted, the facilitator or any core circle member may stop the asynchronous processing by requesting the proposer escalate the proposal to a governance meeting and notifying the circle's secretary. Now, I went to a 5-day-long Holacracy training for 8 hours a day. I've been doing this for 2 years, and I still have no idea what that means. And what's interesting about Holacracy is it really separates the people from the work. So Holacracy is all about the work and not about the people. What's interesting, though, is it's actually sold as a complete system. It's sold as an off-the-shelf solution for companies, when in reality it misses a huge component of companies, the people. It helps me to think about it a little bit more like an iPhone. So an iPhone is an extremely powerful tool, but an iPhone alone is fairly useless on a day-to-day basis. It gains its power from the apps. And so when you think about Holacracy, Holacracy is this really powerful operating system, but it gains its value from when companies develop and build apps to put on top of that. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So why would Zappos, doing great, revenue's great, everyone's happy, even think about struggling through that constitution in this really frustratingly hard to learn system? There are a couple different reasons. The first one is around the concept of cities versus companies. Now, research has actually shown that every time the size of a city doubles, innovation and productivity goes up by an additional 15%. However, the opposite is true at companies. Innovation and productivity goes down by an additional 15%. And the great cities last in the hundreds of years, where the great companies only last in the tens of years. If you think about a city, in most cities, there's no master food planner, there's no top-down hierarchy, but it just works. All that self-organization really just works. And so the thought is, what if we could structure Zappos more like a city and less like a company? Another reason we wanted to go towards this system was around the idea of decision speed. So if you think about it, Zappos was a consensus-based culture. Someone would have a great idea, they'd raise it in an executive-level meeting, and everyone would want to give their input. 6 months later, that same idea would be emerged in a different form. That person wouldn't feel ownership over it, and it really wasn't timely. A final example comes from nature. When you think about clouds, clouds form when they're needed, and they disperse when they're not. If you think about that first org chart we saw, maybe it was edited max once a year, but it really, really doesn't take into account the daily changing needs of a business. What if you could restructure the org chart every single day, almost like a cloud? Now, I would highly encourage you to read this book, Reinventing Organizations, by Frederic Laloux. it takes the work and that component of self-management and really adds back in the people component, which I think is really critical. So Frederic Laloux talks about the different types of organizational systems and layers back in the different stages of human consciousness and human enlightenment. And it really, really resonates for me, more so than Holacracy as a standalone practice. So a bit about me. Prior to being at Zappos, I was at Downtown Project for about 2 years. Now, Downtown Project was founded by the CEO of Zappos, Tony Hsieh, with $350 million of his own personal wealth, with a goal of revitalizing downtown Las Vegas. And I led the Holacracy implementation there. It was about 50 people. We've since paused that implementation. I'm happy to talk more about that offline. Prior to that, I was at McKinsey & Company studying change management and process management. And prior to that, I was at Hilton Worldwide, working on the Hilton brand refresh, and that included the launch of the Hilton Spa, which is today Euphoria. But what I think is really great is that I'm not unique at Zappos. Antoinette is someone I met a couple weeks ago. She's been at Zappos for 4 years. Her first 2 years, she was working in the call center. When we launched Holacracy 2 years ago, she very quickly took on roles in leadership development, Holacracy, tech, emotional intelligence training, and finally tech Holacracy. So think about that. In the course of 2 years, Antoinette has had essentially 6 different jobs in one organization. Now, that would never be possible in a traditional organization. Now, Susie, Nancy, and the Summit team said that you all like data. This is my one data slide. Zappos today has over 500 circles. Those are those groupings of work. And each person has, on average, 8 distinct roles. And again, those could be linked, those could be related to each other, or they could be completely different. And each person is on average 4 different circles. But what have we seen? Zappos has an innovation arm, an R&D arm called Zappos Labs. I'm sure most of your companies have the same thing. And its sole function is to push innovation into the organization, to surface ideas and push that out. Under Holacracy, however, every single person is responsible for driving that innovation. So every single person is responsible for sensing what's going on in their day-to-day life and surfacing that innovation across the company. That's been really cool to see. Another one is around decision transparency. So at the end of every single Holacratic meeting, there's actually a series of meeting notes that's posted internally to an internal software solution. And anyone in the company can see the pretty detailed notes from any meeting, whether it's a high-level executive meeting or whether it's a meeting for an initiative you are interested in. That radical transparency has increased the lines of communication immensely and has really helped people understand what's going on in the company. And by the way, it's also increased decision speed. So Holacracy encourages people to be selfish. You process your tensions on your own time, but this allows people to understand what's going on. Another one is around organizational digestion, or what I call indigestion versus starvation. Most companies don't suffer from a lack of inputs. There are no lack of business opportunities or partnership proposals or vendors they could work with, but they suffer from a lack of digestion, how to process that, how to prioritize that. What Holacracy does is it makes these roles very, very clear, so when the inputs come in, it's very clear who's responsible for prioritizing that, and again, they do that in their own role. They don't need to take into account anyone else's thoughts. And it also prevents the dreaded CC reply all, which I myself am guilty of, where you start an email, you CC a couple people, someone replies all, they CC a couple people, and soon you're on this email chain you have nothing to do with and you don't care about, but you can't get out of it. Finally, employee retention. And this is something we're just starting to understand, but our hypothesis is that Holacracy will actually resonate really well with demographics such as millennials, I myself being one. And the thought is that them being very easily bored, they have these great advancement opportunities within a company and might not leave and move to another company. Now, a couple things we have not addressed: compensation and advancement and promotion. And these are critical. I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't frustrating every day for the employees to not have these things addressed, to not know what they're going to make, not know how they're going to get promoted. They're very, very hairy issues that we're still working on. Now, if this all sounds a bit extreme to you, there's a number of companies practicing self-management. I'd highly encourage you to look into them. Valve, Morningstar, GitHub, Gore-Tex. They've all done a fascinating job of taking the self-management principles and applying them to their own needs. And when you think about where your company is on the self-management spectrum, or where you want to be, you can think about it in a couple different ways. One is companies where you're spending 100% of your time in that primary role. Another is companies in the middles, kind of like the Googles of the world, where you spend 80% of your time in the primary role and 20% of your time on flex projects. And at the extreme is something like Zappos, where we very much want to eventually hire people in with literally no formal job description, and they then spend the first 6 months of their job looking for a job within the company. Now, before you can even think about self-management, there are a couple of really important things you need to have in both your people as well as in your organization. A couple of these in the people: tolerance for ambiguity and self-motivation. Holacracy is a very difficult, hard-to-understand process. These people need to be able to roll with the punches. Another one is around self-motivation. With no bosses, who's to say people don't stay at home all day and do nothing? That's entirely possible. And we've seen many instances of companies, or divisions where it just doesn't work because these people don't have that. And finally, in the organization, again, you can't just sprinkle this self-management fairy dust and fix everything that's wrong with your company. You really need to have a couple of pre-existing conditions in the organization: open and honest communication, trust in others, trust in the organization, and a clear understanding of purpose. Holacracy is a purpose-based management system. If everyone is selfishly processing their tensions with no understanding of the greater purpose, chaos ensues. Now, I could talk for a while about this, but I won't. This is my email address. Feel free to email me for a copy of the slides. I'll be around the rest of the summit if you want to chat more. And if you're ever in Vegas, I'd encourage you to come. We actually do public tours of Zappos, of Downtown Project. Would love for you to see what we're doing and love to talk a bit more about Holacracy. Thank you so much.